Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us on our first webinar in the Standards-Based Instruction series. I'm Kelly Schultz. I'm the Standards Implementation Specialist, and my role at the state level is to support districts and schools with implementing our North Carolina Standard Course of Study in ways that improve teaching and learning for every student. And today we will build a shared understanding of what standards-based instruction is, how our standards are developed and revised, and what this means for our day-to-day classroom practice. So this work is nested within our broader of preparing each student for the next phase in life, which includes college, career, or military pathways. Within that vision, Focus Area 2 is Elevate Teaching and Learning, and Action 3 calls for a pre-K through 12 teaching and learning framework developed with PSUs to set shared expectations. Notice the emphasis: standards-aligned instruction, integrated supports, and access to high-quality learning for all students. Clear, coherent standards are the foundation of that unified framework. So our goal is that no matter which classroom a student enters, they encounter rigorous, standards-aligned instruction that supports their success. If you'd like to follow along, I have put the link to the slide deck in the chat. We are going to be using several resources in there today, but I'll also be putting the links in the chat for you as well as we go throughout our time together. So to understand standards-based instruction, we first need to understand the standards process at the state level. And so North Carolina follows a systematic multi-phase process. I'm going to walk you through each phase so you can see how classroom expectations are informed by feedback, research, and policy, and not created in isolation. So a common source of confusion is the difference between standards, curriculum, and instruction. So if we think about standards are captured in the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. They articulate what students should know and be able to do at each grade level and course. Curriculum includes the texts, lesson plans, activities, tasks, and classroom assessments we use to help students reach those standards. These are designed at the local level by the district, school, or teachers. Instruction is the delivery of that curriculum. So the approaches, the strategies, and differentiation we choose based on our students' needs. These are also determined at the local level. So in short, standards are the destination, curriculum is the route, and instruction is how we drive the bus. So our standard state policy SCOS 012, which requires each set of content standards to be reviewed every 8 to 10 years. This long-term cycle helps ensure that standards remain clear, relevant, and aligned to current expectations for college, career, and civic life. The process is built on 4 guiding principles. It's feedback-based, so NCDPI formally collects feedback on the current standards. We get this feedback from educators, administrators, parents, students, institutes of higher education, business and industry representatives, national organizations, and other education agencies. It is also research informed. So NCDPI will review contemporary and current research on standards and learning in the content area under review. We benchmark with other states, third-party reviews, and comparability of international standards and trends that inform the process. It is also improvement-oriented, so we provide updates to the superintendent and the State Board of Education in an annual report summarizing any feedback that we receive from stakeholders concerning standards and implementation of. And it is also process-driven. The system process includes 4 phases: review, revision, installation, and implementation. It used to only be phases, but we have kind of separated out the installation phase because it was getting lost in there. And we've also made that a longer phase in the cycle. So this slide shows the full 8 to 10 year cycle with review, revision, installation, and implementation. Review and revision focus on the content of the standards themselves, and installation and implementation focus on helping districts and schools put those standards into practice. So think of the cycle as a continuous quality improvement for our expectations for student learning. So the first phase is the review phase. And that's where we're collecting feedback, we're reviewing it from all of our various stakeholders I mentioned earlier. We analyze the research for the content area that's being reviewed, and we establish and we convene a data review committee. The data review committee consists of educators from across the state of North Carolina. There's an application process. Anyone can apply to be a part of that. We make sure that there is a broad range of individuals in various roles in the education setting, and we get them from representation from all of our regions across the state. What they do is they take all of that feedback, they analyze those findings, and they create a report. And then during the revision phase, the standards writing team uses that report that's created by the data review committee. The standard writing team is another group of individuals, of educators from across the state, again, from a wide variety of backgrounds and roles. And that also has an application process so that you can apply to be a part of that standards writing team, where you actually do the work of revising those new standards. And so what happens is the standards writing team takes that report from the data review committee and they create draft one of the standards. What they do is they look at, do we need to keep any of our standards the same from the current course of study? Do we need to revise any of them, maybe make them more specific, parse some things out? Or do we remove that standard completely? And then do we add in any additional standards that are needed based on that? And so we send that draft we present it to the state board. We put it out for public comment for 30 days. So everyone across the state has the opportunity to fill out a survey. It goes standard by standard. So you can say exactly what you like or don't like about that draft one. The data review committee takes all of that information, analyzes it again, writes their second report, gives that second report to the standards writing team. The standards writing team then creates draft 2 of the standards. And we follow that process until we get a draft that gets approved by the State Board of Education. So once the standards have been fully adopted by the State Board of Education, we begin a 2-year installation phase. And so what this does is, it used to only be 1 year, but we have found that we need more time. Teachers need more time, districts, the state, we need to create all of our unpacking documents, because we can't create our unpacking documents until the standards are officially approved, and everyone wants those right away, of course, because those really help us understand that new standard course of study. So what this longer installation period does is it provides us with that time to create those resources, get them in your hands, get out and do some professional development in the field, and still give you an entire second year there to revise your curriculum and your lesson plans and any of your curriculum maps and things like that need to be done. We continue to provide assistance during this time. During installation, the current or old standard course of study is still being taught up until the implementation phase. The implementation phase begins after the 2 years of installation, and that is when we are fully operationalizing those standards. The testing comes in, and then we move forward with that new standard course of study, where we continue to provide professional development and support from the state, and we continue to collect feedback on the implementation of those standards. So this slide provides a multi-year timeline showing when different content areas are in review, revision, installation, and full implementation. You'll see all content areas are staggered across the years. This is tentative, of course, things come up, things have to be pushed sometimes, but this is the plan moving forward. It also indicates when state assessments are aligned to the new standards. And the takeaway is that standards work is ongoing, and different content areas move through the cycle at different times. So currently we are in installation for the English Language Arts standard course of study. Math is currently in revision phase right now, and we're going to be starting the review phase for social studies coming up. So now that we've looked at how standards are developed and maintained, we'll shift to the foundations of standards-based instruction itself. And we're going to focus on how standards-based instruction shapes planning, teaching, assessment, and feedback in your classrooms. Standards-based instruction is an educational approach in K-12 settings where clearly defined academic standards guide teaching, learning, and assessment. In a standards-based classroom, everything from learning intentions to tasks to assessments is intentionally aligned with standards. And this alignment ensures that students know the expectations and teachers can make informed decisions about instruction and intervention. The research base behind standards-based instruction emphasizes three big ideas. First, student-centered learning. That is where instruction is focused on learners' needs, assets, and active engagement. The second is constructivist approaches. Students actively construct knowledge rather than passively receive information. And third is collaborative inquiry, where students learn through interaction, discussion, and shared meaning making with peers. Effective standards-based instruction has several key features. Clear, coherent goals for learning are articulated in student-friendly language and connected to standards. Alignment means tasks, materials, and assessments match the intent and rigor of the standards. An ongoing assessment is used to gauge where students are relative to the goals, not just at the end of a unit. And feedback and adjustment are built in. We respond to assessment data by adjusting our instruction. And finally, there's a sustained focus on mastery. Students progress when they demonstrate proficiency, not just when the time passes. The continuous cycle driven by 4 questions. First, what do students need to know, understand, and be able to do? That is our standards and learning intentions. Second, how will we teach effectively to ensure students learn? This is our instructional planning and pedagogy. Third, how will we know that students have learned? That's where formative and summative assessment comes in. And fourth, what do we do when students don't learn or when they reach proficiency before the expectation? And this drives our differentiation, our intervention, and our enrichment. So let's practice reading a standard using an example. Here we have a CTE example from Ag Mechanics. The standard says to apply leadership in agricultural education. It's broad, and so the objectives within the standard really clarify what that looks like for us. And as you see here, we have standard objective. Moving forward, we plan to have all of our standard course of study as much as possible, as long as it is effective for the content area, to look this way, to have a standard and then have its objectives. In the past, so our current English language arts and our math standards don't look like this right now. They just have standards. But our science, our social studies, they all have standards and objectives. And so if you've seen the new English language arts standards, you will see standard and objectives, like the example that we have on the screen here. And so when we look at, always want to look at the verbs. So we see verbs like remember, apply, and understand. And then we have to look at the content. So then we also see that content in this example has organizations, parliamentary procedure, public speaking, and employment skills. So when planning, we unpack both the skill, which is the verb, and the concept, which is that content, to design aligned learning experiences. And so here is another example. It's a 7th grade science example from the motion and stability strand. And the standard says, understand motion, the effects of forces on motion, and the graphical representations of motion. And so the objectives then specify what students do. They construct explanations about motion. They use models to illustrate balanced and unbalanced forces, and they analyze and interpret graphical data about motion over time. So again, we pay attention to the verbs: construct, use models, analyze, and interpret. And the concepts: position, speed, balance, and unbalanced forces. Now, some of our standards do look a little different. Like I said, as many as possible are going to have standards and objectives, but some of them don't because this is a special case of our student success standards. And our student success standards are our guidance standards. And these are for all of our students, K-12. And these were adopted from the ASCA standards. So there are certain standards that we've done the research and we've looked at the national standards, and the national standards are so effective and good that we choose to just adopt those. And so they will not necessarily look like North Carolina standards in the way that they're written. So here we have an example of this where they're not written with that verb statement in the beginning, but and our unpacking then looks a bit more like what we see here. We have verbs content there listed. So these standards guide instruction in social emotional learning, study habits, and college and career readiness, and should be integrated into content instruction where appropriate. So when we're unpacking or analyzing a standard, we need to look at the skills, which come from the verbs, and the concepts. So here we have an example. I have another science example, understanding how various forces affect the motion of an object. And so what I've done here is I've pulled out the skills, those verbs, understand, ask questions to summarize. And then I've also pulled out the concepts. What is it that students are doing with those verbs, right? So concepts involve understanding forces in motion, summarizing relationships, magnetic interactions, cause and effect, push and pull, and data and variables. And what I want you to notice is I pulled out some concepts there that aren't explicitly listed in the standard itself, right? So students have to understand data and variables, which you don't see that in the wording of the standard objectives, and cause and effect. So what I'm doing is I'm really analyzing what are those underlying or foundational skills my students need to have in order to fully meet the grade level expectation of this standard. And so sometimes we have to do a little bit more digging. We can go to the unpacking documents that are created to support, which will help you find some of these additional concepts, or we just use our professional judgment. This is really great PLC work so that you're not doing it alone. So what I want us to do is I don't want it just to be me sitting here talking to you the whole time. So I'm going to have a couple activities for us to do. And since we have a very large group here with us today, which I'm very excited about, we have 100 people on right now. So I'm going to provide you with some independent practice time. So you're going to access this chart. I'll put it in the chat for you. And you're going to make a copy of that slide deck. So it's going to bring you to a slide deck, and you're going to make a copy of it. And then you're going to find your content area or add your own standards. So I just chose at random some standards from each content area. If you want something more specific, like if you know you're working with a standard this week with your students or in an upcoming unit, please pick that. But what I want you to do is I want you to complete the chart the way I just did for you. I did this, I pulled out the skills, remember those verbs, and then I pulled out those concepts, and I thought about some concepts that are not explicitly named. So we're going to have you do that. I'm going to pull this link for you. And put it in the chat. So here is the skills and concepts activity. It is in the chat. It's also linked to the slide deck if you're following along with the slide deck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us 5 to 10 minutes here. If you'll just go ahead and work through, make a copy of the slide deck, find your content area and grade level, and analyze that standard. And then I'm going to ask you to pop some things in the chat when we come back. So independent work time, and I'll be back in 5 minutes, sorry. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute or type in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it.
whatever you order and you feel you need a refund for it, just um let's take it to them.
So you're a parent. Okay, that was about 5 minutes of work time. And I hope that you were able to find your content area and your grade level and put in some of that information where you pulled out the skills and the concepts. And so this is really important as the basis for everything that we do moving forward with our planning, because we really have to understand all of those skills and concepts that are really being asked of that grade level standard. Because when we assess a grade level standard, we are assessing it for its whole parts. So all those objectives and how they connect and fit together to really give understanding to that entire standard. So we're going to talk next about teacher clarity and the importance of that. So what do we do now that we've kind of analyzed our standard? What do we do next? And so this slide here highlights the importance of teacher clarity, which has a high effect size, according to John Hattie's research, of approximately 0.85 on student achievement. And that is extremely high. So teacher clarity really comes from, do you understand the content that you're teaching fully? So do you understand those standards? Can you break them apart and analyze them the way that we just did with those skills and concepts? But additionally, it requires that we provide our students with clear learning intentions, success criteria, and transparent expectations of what quality work looks like for our students. And so standards-based instruction provides the foundation for that clarity by anchoring our intentions and success criteria within those standards. And so what am I talking about here? I'm talking about learning intentions, or we often call them learning targets or objectives. But basically, what is it? What is the goal that we want students to accomplish? And so here we see how a standard becomes concrete learning targets for our students, because providing students with standard and that language is not really helpful for them. We want to make sure that we put this into student-friendly language. And so our example here is a social studies example and asked students to explain how movement and settlement patterns affected the development of civilizations, empires, and societies across several regions. And so the learning intentions unpack that into two clear ideas: understanding how emergence, expansion, and decline can be influenced by movement and settlement, and understanding how migration and settlement lead to cultural, social, political, and economic change. And so the formative assessment, the task, the learning task, so what is it students are going to be doing to reach that understanding, is that they're going to create a flow chart showing how migration or settlement patterns influenced a civilization. It directly aligns with these intentions. And so we want to share these learning intentions with students in language that they can understand, and it's essential to their motivation and engagement for their learning. And it supplies them with that purpose for learning, kind of that what and why behind it. But we often stop at learning intentions or learning targets, and we don't go to that second part, which of teacher clarity, which is success criteria. Students need to understand what success looks like when engaging in that learning task. So success criteria translate the learning intentions into I can statements that students can use to self-assess. And so for this standard, students should be able to create a flow chart, explain how movement impacted the development of the Aztec and Roman empires, and explain how settlement patterns impacted those empires. So notice that the criteria specify both the product, a flow chart, and the understanding, linking movement and settlement to development. So when students see these criteria, they know what quality work looks like and what they are working toward. So they understand what it takes to be successful. They can monitor their progress as they're completing those learning tasks. You can also co-construct success criteria with your students. Ask them, what does success look like? What is an effective use of this strategy? So a great way to set up all this learning and share with your students is to create a learning inventory. And so this learning inventory is a planning and reflection tool. It can be used with any North Carolina standard. The columns prompt you to articulate learning targets and intentions, identify tasks and assessments, and define success criteria for proficiency. So using this tool regularly helps ensure alignment between standards, instruction, and assessment. And as you see here, we have the rating, which is really great for student self-assessment so that they understand where they're at prior to their learning and at the end of their learning. So here's an example from 8th grade ELA. And this example makes it explicit for students and teachers to know the purpose, goals, and strategies for teaching and learning. And so as you see here, we have two standards that the students that we're planning to teach the students, and that is conduct short research projects to answer a question, including generating your own questions, and analyze how texts make connections among and distinctions between elements. And so what they're going to do for their learning intentions is develop research questions, research a topic and its ideas, and understand ways authors make connections and distinctions in a text. And so students need to know, okay, what are those tasks that I'm going to be doing? How am I actually going to be manipulating this content? And so they're going to read and annotate a mentor text. They're going to complete a concept map, write research questions, complete a credible site checklist because they're reviewing sources, create additional questions, and then they're going to outline an essay. And so what does success look like? Students know that they're going to analyze how text makes connections between ideas and events. How are they going to do that? They're going to do that through that task of the concept web. They're going to identify credible sources for research. How are they going to do that? They're going to do that with that credible site checklist. And then they're going to write about their topic in an organized way. If they can outline an essay, they're working on their organizational skills. And so students see kind of that bigger purpose for completing the activities that they're doing. And so before we practice with this, I want to share a resource with you. We have what's called the External Implementation Guide. And so what this does is it pulls together the standard course of study content areas and additional required standards and initiatives. So we know that the DPI website can be somewhat tricky to navigate. We've heard your feedback. And so what we've done is we've created this Canvas site, this open Canvas site for you to access all of the standard course of study materials. And so you see here at the top, we have all of our content areas listed there. All you do is click on one of those icons. It'll bring you to their hub full of all the resources, the unpacking, the crosswalks, any standards aligned resources for that content area, glossaries, things of that nature. We also have the literacy instruction standards, which I'm going to talk about those more in our final segment today. And then we have other things. We have additional initiatives. We have global education, portrait of a graduate, character education, things like that. And finally, we have some standards-based resources. We have our standards translated into Spanish. We have searchable spreadsheets that make it really easy to go in and pull your standards to copy and paste them into your lesson plans. We know that that is somewhat tricky with our PDFs, so we've put them into spreadsheets for you. And then for leaders, there are some installation resources there to guide you through that installation phase of the standards review process. And so I show you this because we're about to use it. So in this next task, you're going to practice using a learning inventory. And first, you're going to access the learning inventory template, which I have linked to the slide, and I'm also going to put it into the chat for you in a second. You're going to choose a standard from the external implementation guide that I just showed you for your content areas, or the CMS, if you are a CTE teacher here with us today, or the computer science standards are linked there separately as well. And then what you're going to do is you're going to fill out that learning inventory. You're going to write clear learning intentions. You're going to design your tasks and assessments aligned to that standard, and then define your success criteria that reflect proficiency. So here, let me put the learning inventory in. Maybe if it will let me. Okay, here is the learning inventory that you are going to, once again, make a copy of it so that you can manipulate it. And then I'm also going to give you the external implementation guide so that you can get to your standard course of study area if you need it. And bookmark that EIG, because that's where we put all of our things. The recording for this webinar will be in there. Any resources related to your standard course of study. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us 10 minutes of work time, and I want you to create a learning inventory. Think about maybe a lesson you have coming up this week or next week, and think about which standards you want to put in there, and then create that learning inventory. If you have questions, once again, while we're working, please unmute or type in the chat. Okay, that was about 11 minutes of work time. May not have been enough, but for the sake of keeping things in our hour today, I am going to move on. I hope that you were able to find that useful and see how it can be used for you and your students. That, to me, that's something, if you have several standards listed or depending on what you're working on, that could be a plan for, 5 days of instruction. At the beginning of the week, they can self-assess. At the end of the week, they can do the same to see how they've met those learning intentions and success criteria. To me, it's like a mini lesson plan. So I hope that you find that useful. We will continue to use more resources like this as the series continues. So our final topic for today is implementing all of the standards. So standards-based instruction means implementing all relevant standards, not just our content standards. So this includes the digital learning standards, the literacy instruction standards, and English language development standards. So integrating these standards ensures that students develop academic knowledge, literacy skills, and digital citizenship simultaneously. So our digital learning standards are aligned with the ISTE student standards and capture roles such as empowered learner, digital citizen, innovative designer, global collaborator. And these standards support students in using technology safely, ethically, and creatively to support learning across all content areas. And as we plan instruction, we can intentionally align tasks that involve technology to specific digital learning standards indicators. And so their unpacking looks very similar to ours. We have some verbs in there. They have some sample in the classroom ideas for you. They call this document the grade band indicators. So here, this slide zooms in on the digital citizen strand. And so the articulation describes students recognizing the rights, responsibilities, and opportunities of living, learning, and working in an interconnected digital world and acting in safe, legal, and ethical ways. And so indicator examples show what it looks like in practice. So in that media literacy and online safety, distinguishing ethical from unethical behavior, explaining their digital footprint, things like consequences of unethical technology use. And so these behaviors can be embedded into research tasks for your students, online discussions, and any assignment requiring those digital tools that they're using. So in addition to the digital learning standards, we are all literacy teachers. And what I mean by that is that we are not all ELA teachers, but we all have to teach literacy skills related to our content area. So in other words, we need to teach students to read like a historian or write like a scientist. And so to understand that, literacy development is conceptualized here as a progression from basic literacy to disciplinary literacy. So ideally, basic literacy and foundational skills are typically mastered K-5. We know there are exceptions to this. But generalizable literacy skills that are transferable across content areas, those are emphasized mostly in grades 6 through 8. And then that specialized disciplinary literacy, those skills are the focus in grades 9 through 12. We start to introduce those in middle school and elementary school, but our main focus at the high school level then is, when I say a history teacher is a literacy teacher, it means that you are informational text experts, right? And you really teach your students how to think like a historian. And so standard instruction must consider where students are on this continuum and intentionally build from basic skills to more complex, discipline-specific literacy demands. Now, we are not all trained in literacy, but what we have are our literacy instruction standards to support us for this work. So if we think about the standard course of study as the what we teach and the literacy instruction standards as the how of teaching that content, then we can successfully use these in our classrooms. And so these standards are legislatively mandated for all teachers in all content areas to use during instruction. So if you're not familiar with them, get familiar with them, basically. And so let me talk a little bit more. So the literacy instruction standards are anchored by these 12 components that you see here. And when planning, we consider which components are most relevant to a given standard and how to integrate them into our daily lessons. So I like to point out that several components are specified here for elementary grades, and this is because the foundational reading skills are ideally mastered in elementary grades. And when students struggle with them at the secondary levels, they are seen as interventions. And so these standards were written for core instruction. So while it says K-5, you can absolutely use, though there are struggling secondary students with some of these foundational skills. And additionally, comprehension, I like to point out, is broken into 3 categories: discussion and writing, strategy instruction, and knowledge building. So we often say or notice that our students struggle with comprehension, but that is really broad and it doesn't tell us a lot. It's really hard to drill down when our students struggle with comprehension to what is the actual skill that they're struggling with. And so we need to break down comprehension to see where students are truly struggling to intervene and differentiate. And so it could have been broken up into even more categories, but these are the most manageable and make sense for our standard course of study. So discussion and writing, strategy instruction, and knowledge building are all parts of comprehension. Let's take a look at what these standards look like. So when I talked about the standard course of study, I said they are written in standard and objective form. These are not student standards. These are teacher standards. And so they look a little different. And so they look like this page is an example of one where we have the literacy component on top. It tells right there, comprehension, discussion, writing. And then underneath that, it has the literacy instruction standard, which is the what. What is it that I'm teaching? These are what you must do, but they're also very broad. So what we did was we created some instructional practices, which is the how. And there's examples like posing high-level questions, integrating problem-based learning, engaging students in analytical and reflective writing are some examples. Now, the standard you must do, you must teach. But the instructional practices are suggestions because that gets into when we talked about before standards, curriculum, and instruction, that gets into that instruction piece that is a choice as local control, local decision on your part. However, these are all research-based, evidence-based practices to teach them. There's nothing new or crazy in here that you've never seen before. It's just about us being more purposeful and intentional about incorporating literacy into our daily instruction. And so when we plan, we can map these practices directly into our content lessons to deepen comprehension and discourse in this example. To support this integration, we have resources. We have an entire literacy instruction standards toolkit that can be found through that link that I shared with you, the external implementation guide. These resources show concrete ways to embed literacy practices into subject areas like math, science, social studies, CTE, and the arts, healthful living, world languages, all those content areas. And so it's actually linked to the image on the slide here. And so it's just another resource for you to use specifically. So what does comprehension, discussion, and writing look like in math classroom, in a CTE classroom, things like that. So we had our digital learning standards and we had our literacy instruction standards. We also have a lot of multilingual learners in our classrooms, and we need to understand how to support them through instruction in the curriculum. And so it's really important to be familiar with the framework for the English language development standards. So these look a little different, again, because we adopted them from WIDA, the national standards, across all content areas. So it includes ELD standard statements, key language uses like narrate, argue, explain, inform, things that we're asking our students to do, and language expectations and proficiency level descriptors. So there are 5 standards for ELD, and they cover language for social and instructional purposes, language arts, math, science, and social studies. And so this framework helps us align language supports and expectations with both content standards and students' English proficiency levels. Now, for those of us who are not in ELA, math, science, or social studies, I really want us to focus in on ELD Standard 1. So 2 through 5 address those specific content areas. Standard 1 expectations apply to all content areas. Anytime students are explaining processes or reasoning, we can intentionally support this ELD standard with our students. So I think it's important to know these standards because you want to know when your students are pulled out of your classroom, what is it they're doing with their ML teacher, and how in the classroom, what are the expectations for those students, and how can I support them using my content? And so what does this look like? How does this fit into our learning inventory? We can map the digital learning standards, the literacy instruction standards, and the English language development standards to what we're already doing. So it's not piling another 3 things on top of what we're already doing. It's the natural integration that is really important for our students to see. So for example, standard W8.5 asks students to research and generate questions. If students are doing this, they're also addressing ELD Standard 1 to generate questions about different perspectives. So we know that our ML students, that's aligning with what our content area expectations are. And if students are creating a credible site checklist for their sources, they're hitting the digital learning standard to demonstrate an understanding and respect for the use and sharing of intellectual property. So adding in some conversation about why we use this checklist, how it's used, how we use it ethically. These are just natural ways of integrating those DLS digital learning standards into our conversations and classroom instruction. And if students are outlining their writing, the teacher is using the literacy instruction standard that teaches students components of the writing process. So the idea is that all these standards are not extras, but that they work together purposefully. And so by being able to just be purposeful and intentional about choosing which standards we're teaching, how we're using them, we can really just make this integration come to life for our students. I had us doing one more task, but it is 5:02, so I am cognizant of that. If you would like to, the resources are on this slide. Basically, I was just going to have you do what I did, just map those 3 different standards onto the learning inventory that you had already started. I want to let you know that this was the first in a 3-part series. So this really laid the foundation. We're going to talk about differentiating standards-based instruction in March. The registration is, and then we're going to talk about aligning our standards-based instruction, thinking about instruction and assessment practices on April 14th. So the registration is also linked there. I will put the link to the slide deck again in the chat for any of you that may have missed it. And I just want to say thank you very much for your participation today and joining me. And I really hope to see you in March. And I'll stay on a couple minutes. If you want to unmute or ask me something in the chat, I'll stay on for any individual questions. But thank you very much. I apologize if my screen sharing stopped throughout that. I'm not sure what happened.